I'm Shar Banerjee, and this is Books That Built Me. I'm an ex-executive turned to leadership coach specializing in people managers. My job is to get people out of that manager headspace and really more into their leadership growth space. I typically work with clients to build their leadership DNA and their self-leadership muscles in group programs or one-to-one coaching. But on this show, we dive deep into the stories of others. And it all starts with a book that they believe has truly influenced their decisions, and now these book lessons have turned into life lessons. Welcome to Books That Built Me. Today, I'm in conversation with Chloe DeChow about the book The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin, who is also the author of the #1 New York Times bestselling book, The Happiness Project. You should be listening to this episode of the podcast if there are some questions here that intrigue you. The Four Tendencies hold practical answers if you personally have ever wondered why people can rely on me, but you can't rely on yourself. Or how do you work with somebody who refuses to do what you ask? Or how do you work with somebody who keeps telling you what to do? How, if you are in the medical field, how can you convince your patients to take their prescriptions or think about a certain topic in a certain way? If you've ever wondered how your team can become more effective with less wasted time and conflict, and that's an open question for you at all times, this is certainly a book that can get you some great insight into some of those topics and other questions. I'm so glad you could join us. Here we go. Welcome, Chloe. Today we're talking about The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. Such a great book. And quick introduction, Chloe. Chloe is the founder of West Haven, where she helps women business owners build authority in an authentic way. Welcome, Chloe.
Thanks, Shar. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh my gosh, me too. So let's dive in. I feel like this is one of those books where it is difficult to start easily talking about things without first getting into the four categories. So high level, this book is born out of the question, how do I respond to expectations? How do I respond to expectations? And Gretchen Rubin came on four specific tendencies that holds practical answers to this question of how do I respond to expectations? So Chloe, is it okay if we just spend some time talking about what the four categories are and giving our listeners some understanding and idea behind what it is? Okay.
Yes, I think it would be really hard to understand what we're talking
Right?
about without that foundation.
Right. Okay. So if you can imagine a grid of four, like a 2x2 grid, essentially, if you think about expectations, when somebody, the question really is, how do I respond to expectations? And the simplest way to think about it is expectations live in us and expectation lives out of us, i.e., do I meet my own expectations and do I meet others' expectations? So let's start with Upholder, which is the positive on both categories. This is how my brain works, by the way.
I haven't heard that term used, but I like it. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. When I was reading this, my brain was just mapping it out. And so I go positive, which is Upholder, i.e., they meet their own expectations and they meet outer expectations. How would you, what's your quick way of describing what an upholder is, Chloe?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe an upholder is somebody who, let's see, if we think about it in like a team structure, right? So somebody who is really a high performer, meets the expectations of somebody who, like their boss or somebody else that's given them, and they do the job, they hit the deadline, and then they go home and they do their workout routine and nobody else holds them accountable. They just know that's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And, they make their dinner and they're just like, they're on it.
They sleep on time. They know what's required of them. They don't, they just go.
Yes. And so they're meeting the expectations of the people around them, and then they're also meeting this like internal expectation of like, I'm going to work out, or I'm going to do, it doesn't have to be working out. It could be like journaling every day. They're very good at routine and habits.
Yeah.
And the downside is that they don't always question why they're doing what they're doing. And so sometimes they might adopt projects or to-dos or self-care habits that actually don't necessarily make sense for them individually, but they're so good at meeting expectations that sometimes they don't stop and pause and say, wait, why am I doing this? Or what's the benefit of doing this?
Yeah.
Is this good for me?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So the pro is that they're really good at all these things. The downside is they don't always question why they're doing what they're doing.
They're not, yeah. And so there's almost this rigidity as well, right? Like once they are in progress, like, you know, that what comes to mind is like that buffering thing, like buffering in progress. When that's happening, they just keep continuing until it hits the end mark. And within that time period, there's no questioning, there's no altering, of course. And there's this almost rigidity in that process. But to your point, the earlier stuff that you said, I mean, they're self-reliant, they're self-starters, they're good at execution. And the motto that Gretchen Rubin says that belongs to this category of people is discipline is my freedom. Discipline is my freedom. So I'm just going to give it away. This is my husband. After I read this book, of course, I made all my close friends and family take this because I'm like, who are you? I need to understand you in the context of this. And my husband is this person. And it's wild because everything he says to me, now I say, well, that's a very upholder thing of you to say or do. How interesting is that?
I need an example of this, Shar. What upholder examples can you share from your experience with your husband?
We were just catching up at the end of the day, and you know, and he brought his laptop to bed, and I'm like, are you working? He's like, no, I'm just updating a spreadsheet. I'm like, what spreadsheet do you have that is not work related? And he says, no, I'm just marking down my workout and I'm recording what I did and tracking my steps and putting it in my spreadsheet. And I just looked at him and I said, wow, that is such an upholder thing to do. Nobody's checking that spreadsheet. It's not shared with anybody. It's yours to own, and you love it. And he had made this decision, I don't know, a few months ago, and he's been so consistent about it. So that is
such a good example. And I'll give away that both Shar and I are questioners, which we'll get into next.
Yes.
But the thing that first comes into mind is like, what is he doing with this data? Like what are you good? Like, cool, you're tracking it, but like, what are you doing with it? What will it inform? Which is a total questioner response to that.
Yeah.
So,
and you know what? I asked him that, and he said it gives me fulfillment. So again, it's that it feeds the inner. The data feeds the inner expectation that he has of himself. And that's it. Like, there is no so what with the numbers and there's no so what with the graphs. It's that the graphs are being built meets that inner purpose.
Yeah. And for him, he doesn't need that, right? Yeah. He doesn't need it. And that's okay. I think if you and I were to do it, it'd be a total different story. So, funny. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go into questioner then, because questioner, the plus is on meets inner expectations. So we do what we want. We do what's expected of us from an internal standpoint. But there's a minus on the meets outer expectations. And by the way, I feel like it's a, quote unquote minus. Like, of course, we do what's expected of us to a certain extent, but we don't prioritize that in its entirety. Like, that's not the sole purpose of our time here on Earth. Okay, so we meet our own inner expectations. We don't necessarily meet outer expectations. And then I'll give away the motto, because there's always a motto for each of these tendencies. The motto is, I will comply if you convince me why.
Yes.
How else would you describe what a questioner is, Chloe?
Yeah, I think for me, it's that it's not so much that we completely oppose external expectations. It's that if we can buy in to that external expectation, then it becomes an internal expectation for us. And
yes.
we'll meet it because we get it and we understand why the time and energy and the resources and all of this is going towards something. But if we don't buy into it, we don't get the why, it's a lot less likely to happen.
Totally.
So yeah, like we need to understand the rationale behind something.
Yes.
And, the gift in that is that we are always, it's a kind of like we're challenging the status quo, or we're trying to make the, figure out like that we have the right information to make good decisions. There's a lot of good things that can come from
Lots.
not just
Yeah.
taking things as is. And there can also be some challenges. So,
But
Shar,
wait,
do you
no,
want to?
no, hold on. I just want to say you're welcome, world, for questioners, because we make the world better. Like, we make the world better, So, like, for example, questioners are the people in meetings who say, let's say something's due for Friday. Well, why are we doing this for Friday? Like, what's the significance behind Friday? Or what's the point actually of this report? And even like the person who's giving the direction, like, why are we even listening to you? And so I think by default, not to be argumentative, but just to like, there's this desire to make processes better. And I see this within myself. Like, I have this affinity for efficiency, and that's how I've always thought about myself. But now I see it as a byproduct of being a questioner. Like, I am a questioner because I am in love with creating efficient processes and an efficient way of being. The negatives, unfortunately, there are some. Unfortunately, we got some negatives.
This is a very humble account from two questioners.
Yeah. It's overwhelm. It's information overwhelm.
Analysis paralysis.
Correct. And I think in terms of what we can do to other people is we can drain the energy with the constant questioning. And I have 100% seen that firsthand. Thank you very much. But in your life, if you have a questioner, there's this, really great hack for if you know that you're working with a questioner, they do great with limits and they do great with redirection to an expert, because that's really the bottom line for any net new topic that you're reviewing or thinking about is if you can just go to an expert, a questioner will instantly be like, okay, I'm not going to do the work. I'm going to go to somebody who specializes in the work. And whatever they say, I now have the buy-in of the authority. And therefore, I can kind of move on with my job faster. So there are ways to work with us. And these, these hopefully
Life
help.
hack.
Life hack, yeah.
Yes. I have a great example. So this is the other thing that's interesting about questioners, which
Tell me.
I was not self-aware about until I read this chapter on them. But one of the things is that questioners, even though they love asking all the questions and playing devil's advocate and doing all the angles of everything, which has gotten me into trouble before, but they also hate being questioned themselves.
Yes.
And the reason for that, the real rationale behind being annoyed is because we've already done the research and you should just believe us when we say we made the best decision possible.
Exactly.
But this happened with me before I read this chapter, actually. This happened I think it was the day before I read this chapter. And I was talking to my husband about my business and some of these like business decisions I was making. And he said something like, well, what made you decide to do that decision instead of doing this decision? And I just shut down. I was like, I'm not having this conversation with you. And if I had asked him that question, he would not have cared like at all. He would have dived in, shared all this information. But like for me, I was like, why don't you just trust me that I'm making the best decisions I possibly can make?
Yeah.
And so I literally laughed out loud when I read that part of the chapter, because I was like, oh yeah, that was more about me than it was about him.
Yeah.
That reaction. So yeah, it's funny that we want to ask all the questions, but we don't want the questions asked of us.
So that is such a good point. And there is a section on relationships for questioners, which we can totally get into because you and I are both questioners. So there is this point in the relationship, if you are in a relationship with a questioner, and let's say you want for them to do something that does not necessarily make logical sense, but is important to you. The answer to why should I do this, even if this is important to me and you love me, is sufficient. And I thought that was so cool to read because sometimes I will get into these conversations of what is the point of this one action? Like, explain it to me rationally. And sometimes there's no answer apart from it's important to me. And I would love for you to do it because it's important to me. And I want you to remind yourself of my part in this as well. And that has worked. Like, that is truly something that works.
Yeah. And I think that also goes to show that the reason why doesn't always have to be this like deep life purpose and like questioning like the reason we're all here, which I think we probably do a lot of as questioners. It can be as simple as, well, it's in the contract with my client, or it's my spouse, this is really important to my spouse, or daycare drop off says that we get 2 warnings if we're not there by 9 and we haven't alerted them before they, you have to go find another daycare, whatever the reason can be. Like, as long as it's important enough for us that the consequence like is not worth it, we will do it. So I think that's another good point.
She gives a really good example too of how she texted her husband, like, go pick up, I don't know, sandwich material, like bread. We need bread. Please pick up bread. And she says, well, if I only said that, it wouldn't get done. Because the question back would be, well, why wasn't this part of the grocery list for the Sunday grocery time? And why do I have to go to the grocery store for one item? Makes no sense. Like, wrap it up and it'll be in next week's grocery. And she goes, well, if I just changed my text message to the kids need extra snacks and they have other friends popping over and we need to make more sandwiches and we're out of sandwich materials, we really need bread for tomorrow, it's done. Like, for sure, there will be bread by the end of the night. So I thought that was a really, like, I think she's very generous in her examples of her own personal life, which also then, I guess, help you see how personal this can be. It's not just work context, it's relationships and professional experiences with doctors and conversations with friends, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, definitely. I think there's so many different examples. And then once you learn these, you start picking up on them too in your life. You're like, oh my God, that makes sense now. I bet they're an obliger, or I bet they're, an upholder or whatever.
True.
So it's true. It's very, very interesting. I also want to point out the fact that, Char and I have talked about how, and Gretchen points this out in the book, that questioners even question the Four Tendencies and the statistical psychological research that has been done and how realistic or real it is. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
For sure. Oh my gosh, for sure. As soon as I took the test, I'm like, what? That's like 10 questions. How can you know who I am from 10 questions? Like, this isn't even real. So I did it again. And you know what? As I did it again, I recognized that is such a questioner thing for me to have done. And so then I went back to the book. So the way that I approach this book is just curiosity. I opened it and I just started reading without having taken the test. And so when I read about questioners, I was like, cool, good for them. Upholders, cool, good for them. And then when I took the test and I'm like, oh, I am a questioner, I instantly went back to that section. And then every single line made sense to me. I was like, that's me. I don't like standing in lines. I question. I hate standing in. I don't know if you're the same, Chloe, but I hate it. And if there's a shortcut that most people don't look at, I'm always looking for the shortcut.
Oh my gosh, okay. So there at my Target, there are self-checkouts and then there's the regular checkout aisles. And in the far back behind the checkout aisles, there's another self-checkout that nobody knows about. And you better believe that I'm over there feeling a little guilty, but like mostly not because, they should have just thought of it themselves to go to this checkout that no one's at. Yes. Whatever the shortest way around something, I'm on it.
Yeah. This one time I was standing in line for a concert and there were like 300 people who didn't see a separate line. 300 people standing in an excess line. And I was like, no, that just makes me mad. That makes me angry. Anyways, that's questioner. We should move on to maybe we'll go to the flip side. So where we talk about we meet our inner expectations and we resist outer expectations. The flip side to that is obliger, in that they meet others' expectations and they resist their inner expectations. Who are these people, Chloe?
My husband is one of these people.
Oh my gosh, tell us more.
Yes. Yeah. I'll use him as an example to explain this tendency. So an obliger, and I've worked with a lot of obligers too.
Same.
So an obliger is somebody who is really good at like meeting the deadline, taking on the project. They say yes. They help their family out a lot. They're there for their people in their life, whether that's their boss or their mom or their kids. Like they're very there and in service of others. And because they're so in service of others, they often do not meet their own inner expectations, whether that's like self-care or health or New Year's resolutions, whatever version of that is for them. They really struggle with it, and they can feel very depleted and have a hard time meeting those expectations if they're not held accountable to them by somebody else.
Yes.
And so my husband is a perfect example of this. He's a very high performer at work, always goes above and beyond. Like he ends up doing things that aren't even technically in his job description because he's just proven that he is so good at what he does and he's going to say yes and he's going to make it happen, that people come to him all the time asking for help and he's overwhelmed and overloaded.
Right.
And so I have a joke with him. I'm like, you got to stop being so good at your job because or you need to start saying no to people, which I know is not an easy thing to do in a work environment, but how figuring out how to say no or not yet can be really helpful for an obliger.
Yes.
And having that external accountability for your own inner work or inner things you want to do can help kind of motivate you to meet your, exercise goals or your journaling goals or reading, being part of a book club is a great example of, reading books if that's something that you want to do. And so that's kind of the life hack, so to speak, for an obliger is having that external accountability. But here's the catch, which is something I did not learn until reading this book, was that obligers will also, depending on the people in their life, they might actually take external accountability from someone like their spouse and turn that into internal accountability. And so their spouse might be like, hey, I really don't want you to leave your shoes on the floor. I have no experience with that particular pet peeve. Or, putting your empty cans in the recycling bin or something like that. And, naturally you would think, oh yeah, an obliger would be all over that because somebody else is asking. However, they actually, if there's somebody really close that they know is going to love them no matter what and is going to, going to like accept them, they tend to internalize those expectations and they don't treat it the same way that they would like a boss or a colleague or somebody in their, greater network, which I thought was fascinating and absolutely rings true for our relationship. And so
then what do you do? Yeah.
That is a good question. I haven't totally hacked that one yet.
Okay.
Part of me is like, oh, I wonder, like, so here's another example of this. My husband, his name's Mike. He was an Army guy and now he's in tech and has always health has always been important. And he's like, I've told him like, oh, you can be my personal trainer, like just as a joke. But every time he does do a workout, which he'll do, like he'll be on like a meeting and he'll be off camera and he'll go do a quick workout. He'll be like, you didn't invite me to this workout. Like you're my personal trainer. You're supposed to invite me to the workout. Like that's what a personal trainer does. And we just have this like running joke that he's never invited me. And I was like, I think like he needs the external accountability from somebody else other than me to do some of these things. I mean, yes, he should own his no if there's certain things that I'm asking that don't make sense. But I'm like, maybe there's like an external person that we could bring in for a couple of these different things, like this joke about being my personal trainer. So that's where my head's at. I don't have an answer yet. So any questioners anybody with an obliger who has realized that they're spouse or team member or whatever has internalized those expectations, let me know. Reach out to me if you figured this one out.
So this is interesting because, so they say that in the composition of the world, there are a lot of questioners in the world and there's a lot of obligers in the world, far fewer upholders and far fewer rebels. So the upholder and the questioner, like, we're spending more time here, but it makes sense in like the distribution. Of course, such a questioner thing to do. In the distribution of all of the people at large, so the interesting thing about obligers and the motto for them is, does this matter to anybody else? Is the question that they sit with obviously this little asterisk of unless it's somebody really, really close in their inner tight circle. So for the non-spouses, then the motto is, you can count on me and I'm counting on you to count on me. Like that thing that you said about they are they need that external accountability. Another sort of metaphor that comes to mind is even in blood type. You know how type O is the type of blood that gets along with everybody? That's what an obliger is. Like, they're the type O's of the world. They get along with all tendencies. They really they're the rock of the world. Like, they're the doers of our universe. And what they really need help with is creating the system of outer accountability, not inner, outer accountability. Obviously with this asterisk of unless you're the spouse, and then you need a different hack, which we're still figuring out what the heck that could be.
Yes. Yes. I think they take a lot of pride in being that person for people.
Lots of pride.
And there's a lot of showing up in service of others, which I think is a huge testament to like who they are as people and their heart in their both their work and in their relationships, which I really admire.
Yeah.
And we should also talk about Obliger rebellion because when like Shar said, like they need this external accountability to take care of themselves because they're pouring so much of their heart and soul into the projects and the people around them that they often can forget or deprioritize their own care. And when we think about how we best show up as people, it's when we're taking care of ourselves. And so they do need that external accountability. Maybe it's a personal trainer, like an actual personal trainer. Maybe it's a nutritionist or that book club. Like that external accountability is really key for them to take care of themselves, because if they don't and they take on too many things, they hit a wall.
They
hit a wall. Yeah. I mean, naturally, right? Like if you're taking on everything, they can really hit a wall. They also can tend to be the person that people rely on the most because people know that they're going to say yes.
Yes.
Right.
They're abused actually for that particular reason. In fact, in the book, she talks about how, think about in workspaces, think about that person who's always sweet and charming, has a good smile on their face, great attitude, carries himself well, gets everything done, and then has this dramatic exit from the corporate setting. Like it's a one-liner, I quit, not enough notice. And like, that's the rebellion version of the obliger. And so this is another dimension of the Four Tendencies, which is you can be purely one and you can lean towards one of your neighbors. And rebels lean against obligers. To your point, the break will happen if you're not servicing your own inner requirements, or if your own inner requirements keep getting squished, there will be a time when like the floodgates will break open, and that's what happens in like a corporate setting, for example.
Yes, and I can say that there have been obligers in my life where they have gone, I'm done, I'm over it, I'm done, and it might not be that like one last thing that really broke them, right? Like that might have been like the final straw, but it was probably a lot of other things that have led up to it. Mm-hmm. And so also maybe having, which is hard to do when you're on the other side of this, but having a little grace for that person that again, like it probably wasn't about you.
Yeah.
And it was probably something else going on, but they had hit their limit.
Yeah.
So yes, that self-care and that boundary setting and that accountability is what can help be more sustainable for an obliger. And I think it's not just the obliger's job to be aware of that. It's the people around them too, to be that support network for them.
To help support. There was this part in the book where Gretchen says she was describing the Four Tendencies. And then one of the Q&A from a CEO was, well, how can I hire more obligers? Because they sound great. I need more obligers in my workforce. To which she says, of course, like that is the wrong way of looking at it. Like it's one of the more unethical ways of filling up your workforce is, doing it via personality tests and all of that stuff. Not all to say, like the part that we were talking about, obligers are truly the rock of the world. They do the bulk of the work. And they take so much pride in it. And it's like, it defines their sense of self, and their identity stems from that work too.
Yes. For sure. And I think that what that CEO got wrong too, not just this like essential abuse of, or like viewing obligers through like a lens of taking advantage. It's also that like each of these tendencies plays a role in making, a company or the world or whatever a better place, because they all have their strong suits and are all needed to improve things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Including the rebel.
Let's jump there. So as you can tell, the rebel is the resisting of outer expectations and the resisting of inner expectations. And what it comes down to for their motto is that you can't make me, and also neither can I. And the central question that they're always sitting with is this the person that I want to be? So rebels are, like I said earlier on, there's far fewer rebels in this world and far fewer upholders in the world. And rebels are this unique group of people who are constantly thinking about the choice that they play in the decisions that they get to take. And so a really, great example of this is, let's say you've got, in a corporate setting, you've got people who don't want to attend meetings, and you've identified one of them as being a rebel. A really great way of making a rebel attend a meeting is by expressing their choice in attending a meeting. So it's like, okay, you don't have to attend this meeting, but just so you know, the agenda of this meeting is that the best projects get picked by the attendees, and then, the leftovers are sort of left for anyone else who doesn't show up. But the choice is yours. Like, it's up to you whether or not you want to come. And that is the spark for the change. Like, if you can ensure that choice is at the heart and center of what it is that is meaningful and impactful, then you've got a chance of speaking to a rebel in a language that makes sense to them. What was your big takeaway? / do you know people in your life that are rebels?
I did have a couple of colleagues. We did this exercise at my former employer, and we brought in this wonderful coach. I could talk all day about this coach. She's my coach, so I could talk all day about her. But
I didn't know that, Chloe.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. Okay,
we can talk about how I got to know about the Four Tendencies later.
Yeah.
But I brought her in for a workshop with my team, and the Four Tendencies was part of the workshop. And so I had a couple of colleagues that did test as rebels. And it's kind of interesting because you would think like a rebel in the workplace would be really hard, right? Like, you don't meet your internal or your external expectations. But I think that they find their own way of doing things, and then that's how they can be successful. And so introducing that choice or that freedom, that freedom is a huge value for them. Introducing that into work, and maybe it's as simple as this is the vision for this project or this thing that we're going to do. As long as we get to this end vision, I don't care how you do it. Like, I'm going to give you full reins. You own this. I trust that you're going to get it done. And giving them that freedom and that choice to carve their path their way is how you can create like a work environment in which a rebel can succeed in. And what's really cool is because they don't necessarily follow specific rules, they can get creative in a way where the rest of us can struggle because they see things maybe through a different light. They're often the disruptors, that we have. I know there's a part of the chapter in the book talks about rebels could find like entrepreneurship or being like the CEO really challenging. It's not that it's unheard of, but it's really challenging. But I like when I hear rebel, I hear founder, like somebody who like has that really awesome idea and like is going to get it started, but maybe they need like other people who are in different tendencies to help get it off the ground or help grow it. So they tend to just kind of challenge things and shake things up for us.
Yeah. And I think for me, when I did the test, I was questioner first, but then when I did it again with a few alternate answers, I landed on rebel. So the way I like to think about it is I think I'm a questioner leaning towards rebel. And there are versions of my life where I have seen that show up, which is, like a rebel classic example is you will not do that. Like there's no way, no how you can do that. And a rebel will be like, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. So this is what they mean about resisting inner and outer expectations, because that thing that this person said that you're not going to do, it may not even have been something that they initially wanted to do. But because they resist somebody else telling them how it's going to be, they act in this way. And so I'm going to raise my hand to say, yes, this has been a reality in my life. I have definitely performed in this way of like, I'll show you, like, you'll be eating your words. I got it.
I love that. I think I lean more upholder. I'm not totally sure. Like I think about like, for example, like I think about English class in high school.
Yeah.
And how, so this might be more rebel-esque, but like I would never like, even though I was in AP English, like I wouldn't actually read the books, which is terrible now. And like in hindsight, I'm like, oh man, I wish I actually would have, because I would have all this knowledge about literature and I love reading. So, but at the time I was like, someone's telling me I have to read this book. I'm not reading it.
Right.
But I also like tend to be somebody in the workforce that will like get the job done if I need to get the job done. And so then I wonder, like, do I lean more upholder? I don't know. I wish the quiz would tell you which one you lean towards. But,
I agree. And maybe there's another version coming, like a different iteration that kind of helps with that identification, because that's pretty revealing too. So you mentioned something about how you came across this book. So let's go there. What's the story there?
Yeah. So when I started working with my coach, let's see, that was 2019. I started working with her, and I was going through this kind of phase in my life where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Like I've reached this promotion that I've been wanting, and it's not what I thought it was going to be. And so I hired a coach to kind of work through this like internal battle that I was having. Right. And part of her kind of client onboarding process was around the four tendencies and trying to figure out which tendency you were. And the thing that's really interesting is when I took this back in 2019, I showed up as an obliger. And it's very rare for somebody to be one tendency and then switch later. But a couple years later, I switched to questioner. And I've talked to my coach about this. And apparently the same thing has happened to her, where she tested obliger, but she actually years later tested as a questioner.
Interesting.
And our theory is that like some major life changes have happened between one and the other. And sometimes we might be like there could be some conditioning that happens, whether in the workforce or being a woman or whatever it might be, that kind of has you like pressured into one tendency versus the other. Yeah, I had become a mom between the test, and I also think like when you introduce a child into your life, like a lot of things shift. I mean, you hear that all the time, but once you go through it, you're like, whoa, everything has changed. I now, especially as a questioner, I now question everything. Absolutely. Why am I working this job? Why am I hanging out with these people? Like what, all of this, right? Like all of it kind of bubbles up. And so for me, I had switched to questioner, and after reading the book, I was like, oh no, I think I've always been a questioner. I've always been a questioner. I think I might, and this is where I struggle with a lot of these tests, is I think sometimes we take the test projecting who we want to be, not who we actually are. And I suspect that's what happened when I took it the first time.
This is so fascinating. So let's talk about because we're questioners. Let's talk about how this personality test I say personality test, but I say it lightly because it's not really a personality test. It's a tendency towards a question on how you respond to expectations. So let's leave it at that, and how that compares to Myers-Briggs, for example, or the Enneagram. And so should we go there? Or before we go there, like for the people who don't really know what we're talking about, what's like a simple way of understanding the point of these tests and what they do for, the human psyche?
Yeah. So if I'm going to bottom line it, as we say in the coaching world, bottom line is like
bottom line this.
Bottom line is like the nice way of saying get to the point. I would say that these tendencies are a way to understand how to motivate and influence yourself and others.
Yeah.
Towards a goal or a shared vision or whatever it might be. So I look at it through, when I think about leadership and I think about communications, it's really a way of like making sure we get, if we have a team, like getting everybody on board. And everybody, we all know, like everybody ticks a different way, like they're motivated in different ways.
Yeah.
As a people manager, like some people really care about compensation and other care about like more time off work, and others care more about like
the relationship with other people.
They want more face time with their boss. Other people want autonomy. Like we're all human and we're all different. And so for me, what the Four Tendencies is like, I love one of the chapters. I think it's chapter 12 at the end, where she's like, here's how you communicate to all four tendencies at once.
I love that chapter. Oh, I love that chapter.
Because like you could read all of this and it's all super fascinating. And if she didn't have that chapter at the end, you'd be like, I have no idea what to do with this information.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can we give some examples? Because I think this was so fascinating. And this is the one, whenever I go to corporate offices and I go to their kitchens, invariably there is some form of a display, like a chastising or an authority figure saying something, or like an open-ended question. And so here's an example of one, a sign that says, thank you for taking care of your own dishes. Place them in the dishwasher. If the dishwasher is full, then do this. If the dishwasher is running, then do this. Your mother isn't here to clean up after you. And if something is missing, like if you can't get it done right now, please come back. And so she talks about how this is a sign written by an obliger for an obliger, and it will do wonders in turning off the rebel and turning off the questioner and all of those other people. And so another alternate way is by bringing in choice into the statement and bringing in a reason. So, to help satisfy the questioner for the reason, it helps satisfy the rebel by giving the choice, and then the upholder, if there's clarity in what the expectation is, then it'll get done. So an example of that would be, we don't have a full-time cleaning service available to us this month. And that's going to put a strain on everybody just for the short term. So again, like the explanation, the request is to please take care of your own dishes. However, the choice is yours to have a shared clean space for all of us together. So again, like has a reason, says it in a way that's dignified, says it in a way where there's choice present, and overall the compliance rate for a request like that is scientifically going to be much higher than the original obliger example that I gave.
Yes, it's like, do you want insects to come to our dishes or do you not? Like, like having like that would satisfy me as a questioner. Yeah, and I think as a rebel, it's like, the choices between like insects and dishes or like a clean kitchen. I think most people would pick, the latter.
Like, even for example, when you go to the park and there's these pick up after your dog signs, that's a very like pick up after your dog. There's no explaining why, which I mean, it's obvious, right? Like you are a dog owner, be responsible for your stuff. But yeah, those signs just say pick up.
But that's said as a questioner. Like you get why, right?
I get why. Yeah,
you already get why. So you don't necessarily need the sign to say why.
Totally.
But somebody else might.
Yeah. And so an example of this is dog urine kills plants and poop is stinky. Please be kind and help keep this area nice. Thank you for being a participant. in keeping our community clean.
Yeah. Could be as simple as, do you want to step in it? Or
poop. Do you want to step in it?
Right? Like, no, thank you. I'll pass on that.
Yeah. Thank you for calling that out. That was a really good chapter.
Yes. Yeah. I felt like before that we got to that chapter, I felt a little overwhelmed because I was like, okay, yes, this all makes sense to me. Yeah. And like, what do I do? Like,
what do I do with this?
I can't. Yes, I think like this context helps in a one-on-one communication.
Yeah.
But when you're with a larger group, like a team, or you're doing a podcast interview or whatever it is, or you're speaking one to many, that gets a little bit more complex in the communication. And yet actually it doesn't, because if you check off, the upholder needs information and needs to understand the expectation. The questioner needs to understand the why, the rationale behind it. The obliger needs accountability of some kind, and the rebel needs choice and freedom. And you can cover that in actually a couple, maybe like a sentence or two, but it can seem very complex without that recap. So I did love that chapter.
Yeah. Actually, there was one more thing, if we can spend time here, is when you're speaking to people and you can't get them to do the quiz, what's your favorite 1 or 2 questions that helps you gauge very quickly who this person likely is?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have been as a questioner, I should be asking these questions. I don't know that I have been thinking of it through that lens.
Yeah.
It's more, I think I pay more attention to things like accountability. Like, have they told me like, as a coach, right? Like, have they told me that like accountability has been like super awesome for them? Maybe they're an obliger, right? Like they weren't doing these things before because they didn't have someone like a coach or an accountability partner to help them. Or are they missing deadlines and like their own, deadlines at work, but like they're still going and working out every single day, right? Like, that kind of thing, kind of like noticing and observing people, I think can be really helpful. What's really funny is I've noticed like accountability does nothing for me. Like, and you and I have both gone through coach training. Like, accountability can be a really big part of the coaching model. And for me, I'm like, I'm either going to do it or I'm not. Like, external accountability has not done anything for me, and I'm not going to burden my coach with that. Yeah. But other people, like, they really, really do benefit from that external accountability, and that can be a huge part of why they hire somebody to help them with that.
See, this is the confusing part, because accountability works wonders for me. And so then I'm like, oh, could I be leaning obliger? I don't know.
Is it? Well, let me ask this. Is this accountability for something you were already planning on doing, or is this for something new?
Oh my God. It's an accountability for a desire within that's kind of coming to the surface.
Yeah.
Oh, snap. That's the difference.
So that's why it's working wonders, because you already wanted to do it.
Right. It's already part of my inner desire.
Yeah. So if someone came to you and they were kind of forcing accountability onto you for something you didn't really want to do, or you weren't bought into,
to be like a lipstick maker, I'd be like, what are you talking about? What does that mean? Why would I care about this?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So
that's good.
That might be why. Maybe pay attention next time and just see what comes up. But I suspect it's something you were already bought into doing versus something where you've had to, like, somebody is like trying to get you to do and you're not totally sure.
So super fascinating. I feel like in just the introduction of these tendencies, we've just spent all of our time talking about our personal stories and like the things that we're recognizing that we see in others and ourselves and our, close allies. But just such a fascinating way of looking at the world, and also going deeper than just understanding. It's going more into effective execution.
Yes.
What a great bottom line for this book, huh?
I think so. Yeah.
Great. Well, this was such a fun conversation, Chloe. I had a few, out there questions planned for you, and we just couldn't get to it because our time is out. But this was such a fabulous conversation, great discussion, and I would say a game change for a book. I have recommended this book to so many people as I was reading it because it's just truly such a fascinating, simple way of understanding who you are, what you tend towards, and why it matters. Because, previously I was talking about Myers-Briggs and Enneagram. Those are complicated. And I often don't think of myself, like I have to remind myself, oh yeah, who am I? Oh yeah, that's great. But this, I think, comes to me more intuitively because it's so much simpler. So highly recommend for anyone who hasn't picked it up or anyone who's just kind of curious about who they are, read that chapter. Like do the quiz and then just like read that section because that's fairly fascinating to understand yourself.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating. And I think it's kind of like a way of like once you have a goal, figuring out what you need to hit that goal, whether that is the accountability as an obliger or you need to understand the why or whatever it might be. Like I think it can be a way for you to find your secret sauce to like making that happen.
Yeah.
So I think that's wonderful. And I don't know if we've mentioned this already, but the quiz is free.
Yeah.
So it isn't, I know a lot of personality tests and things like that you have to pay for. This one is a free resource, which I think is also really cool.
But take it if you want to. The choice is yours. Always.
I love that you're applying your knowledge immediately, Shar.
Why would I not?
Why would you not?
See what I did there?
You're going to be experimenting with this with all your things now.
For the rest of my life. Hell yes. And that's it for this episode of Books That Built Me. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a review. It truly helps support what we're doing here. Thanks for listening, and you can always find me on my LinkedIn at Shar Banerjee. If you're dealing with a leadership challenge, I would love to hear from you and have you join our awesome community. And of course, I will talk to you next Tuesday on a brand new episode of Books That Built Me.